My name is Leona, and I'm 58 years old. This Victorian house has been my home for over 30 years, where I raised my son Michael with my late husband David. When David passed 2 years ago, I thought the loneliest chapter of my life had begun. But when Michael married Sarah and they moved back in with me, I believed happiness had returned to these walls. I was wrong. Sometimes the people closest to you can make you feel like a stranger in your own home. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about family. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story hits close to home, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe, because trust me, you'll want to see how this family drama unfolds. Now, let me take you back to how it all began. This three-story Victorian house has been in my family since David's parents passed it down to us when we got married 35 years ago. David and I poured our hearts into every room, creating a home where love could grow. We raised Michael here, watching him take his first steps on these hardwood floors and graduate from college in our living room during the pandemic. When David lost his battle with cancer 2 years ago, he left everything to me. The house, our savings, everything we had built together. The grief was overwhelming, but this house held our memories, and I wasn't ready to let go. Michael understood. At 30 years old, he had his own apartment across town, where he worked as an IT engineer, making decent money and living independently. Then he met Sarah at a tech conference. She was 28, worked in marketing, and had this confidence that could light up a room. I liked her immediately. She was ambitious, driven, everything I wanted for my son. When they got engaged after a year of dating, I was thrilled. Finally, Michael would have the happiness his father and I had shared. They married in a beautiful ceremony 2 years ago and moved into a modern apartment downtown. For a while, everything was perfect. Sarah had a great job at a marketing firm. Michael was thriving at his company, and they seemed to be building the life they wanted together. Our Sunday dinners were filled with laughter and stories about their adventures as newlyweds. But then Sarah's company downsized 6 months ago. Budget cuts hit her department hard, and despite her excellent performance, she was laid off. The job market was tough, and their savings dwindled quickly, trying to maintain their expensive downtown lifestyle. Michael's salary alone couldn't cover their rent car payments and all their expenses. That's when I made what I thought was the perfect solution. Why should they struggle with rent when this big house had more than enough space for all of us? I invited them to move back home temporarily, just until Sarah found new work and they got back on their feet. It would save them money and give me the company I had been missing since David died. Michael was hesitant at first, worried about independence and privacy, but Sarah seemed genuinely grateful. She hugged me tight and said, "Leona, this means the world to us. We promise we won't be in your way." I was delighted to have life in the house again, to cook for more than just myself, and hear conversations echoing through the halls. For the first few weeks, everything felt harmonious. Sarah helped with groceries and cleaning. Michael mowed the lawn and fixed little things around the house. We established routines that worked for everyone. But slowly, small things began to change. Sarah started rearranging items in the kitchen, saying the spice rack would be more efficient in a different location. She suggested new ways to organize the living room that would create better flow for entertaining. At first, I appreciated her input. A fresh perspective never hurt anyone, right? But then she began making changes without asking. I would come home from my book club to find furniture moved or decorations relocated. When I mentioned it, she would smile and say, "Oh, I thought this looked better. Don't you think it opens up the space?" Michael would nod along, always supporting his wife's vision. The first real red flag came when Sarah invited her college friends over for dinner without mentioning it to me beforehand. I walked into my own kitchen to find 5 strangers cooking with my dishes, using my dining room like they owned it. When I asked Sarah about it later, she said, "I'm so sorry I forgot to mention it. But wasn't it nice having the house full of life again?" Something in her tone bothered me, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. By the second month, Sarah had become much more comfortable asserting her preferences around the house. She created what she called household efficiency rules that would help everyone coexist better. Suddenly, there were designated TV watching hours because too much screen time creates negative energy. There were specific times for using the kitchen because multiple cooks spoil the broth. I found myself tiptoeing around my own home, checking if it was okay to use the washing machine or start dinner preparations. When I left my clothes in the washer for an extra hour because I was at my doctor's appointment, Sarah left a note saying, "Please be mindful of others who need to use shared appliances." The passive-aggressive tone stung more than a direct conversation would have. But the real shock came when I went looking for my mother's china cabinet that had sat in the dining room for decades. It was gone. I found Sarah rearranging the living room completely. And when I asked about the cabinet, she said brightly, "Oh, that old thing was taking up so much space. I moved it to the attic to create a more modern flow. Don't you think this is better?" I stared at the empty corner where 3 generations of family history had stood. "That cabinet has been there since before you were born," I said quietly. "Exactly," Sarah replied, not catching the hurt in my voice. It was time for a change. Michael agrees that we need to update this place to reflect who lives here now. Michael, who had been listening from the kitchen, came in and put his arm around his wife. "Mom Sarah's just trying to make the space work better for all of us. The cabinet is safe upstairs." Safe upstairs. Like something you store away because it's no longer needed. That night, I lay awake, wondering when I had become a guest in my own home. The next morning brought another surprise. Sarah had invited her book club to meet in our living room every Wednesday evening. Not our book club, her book club. 10 women I'd never met were suddenly regulars in my house, and Sarah introduced me as Michael's mother, who's staying with us while she figures out her next chapter. Staying with them, I owned this house outright. There was no mortgage, no rent, no figuring out anything. But correcting her in front of her friends seemed petty. So I smiled and retreated to my bedroom, feeling more isolated than I had even when David first passed away. The breaking point of this phase came when I discovered that Sarah had changed the locks on the master bedroom. When I asked her about it, she explained that they needed privacy as a married couple, and since they were planning to start a family, soon they wanted to establish boundaries. It's nothing personal, Leona. We just need our space to be truly ours. Michael supported this decision completely. Mom, you understand right. We're newlyweds and we need privacy. But I had given them privacy. I never entered their room without knocking, never interrupted their time together. The lock felt like a barrier being erected, not just around their bedroom, but around their lives, keeping me firmly on the outside. That evening, I overheard them talking about nursery plans. They were discussing converting my sewing room into a baby room and moving me up to the smaller guest room in the attic, not asking me discussing it like it was already decided. The light is perfect in there for a nursery, Sarah was saying, and Leona doesn't really need all that space for herself anyway. I realized then that they weren't seeing me as the homeowner graciously sharing her space. They were seeing me as an elderly relative who needed to be managed and accommodated, but whose needs came second to their growing family plans. The morning that changed everything started like any other, except I was awakened by unfamiliar voices and the sound of furniture being moved. I threw on my robe and hurried downstairs to find two painters in my living room, covering my walls with primer. Sarah was directing them, pointing to color swatches and explaining her vision for the room. "What's happening here?" I asked, my voice still thick with sleep and confusion. Sarah turned to me with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning. We decided to finally update this room. The colors are so dated, don't you think? We're going with something more contemporary, more us." "We," I repeated. "This is my house, Sarah. You can't just hire painters without discussing it with me first." Her smile faded slightly. "Leona, we talked about this. This house needs updating, and since we're living here now, we should make it reflect our style. Michael and I made this decision together." "Where is Michael?" I demanded. "He left early for work, but he completely supports this. We've been planning it for weeks." Weeks? They had been planning to repaint my home for weeks without including me in the conversation. I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment as the two painters watched this family drama unfold in front of them. "I need you to stop," I said firmly. "This is not your house to redecorate." Sarah's expression hardened. "Actually, Leona, I think we need to have an honest conversation about living arrangements. This is our house now. Michael and I are building our life here. We're planning our future here. And frankly, some of these old-fashioned choices don't work for us anymore." Old-fashioned choices. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "This is my home. I'm letting you stay here temporarily while you get back on your feet." "Temporarily?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Leona, it's been 6 months. We've made this place our home. We've invested time and energy into making it work for our lifestyle. This isn't temporary anymore." I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. "You're guests in my house." "Guests?" Sarah's voice rose. "Guests don't pay for groceries. Guests don't do the majority of the cleaning. Guests don't reorganize entire rooms to make them more functional. We're not guests, Leona. We're residents. This house needed younger energy, fresh ideas, and honestly, you should be grateful that we're willing to take care of this place. The words hit me like physical blows. Take care of this place. I had been taking care of this house for over 30 years. I had maintained it, loved it, preserved it through decades of life changes. Now this woman, who had been here for 6 months, was telling me I should be grateful for her improvements. When Michael came home that evening, I was waiting for him. I expected him to be shocked to support me to remind his wife that this was his mother's house and she had overstepped. Instead, he looked tired and frustrated when I explained what had happened. "Mom," he said, running his hands through his hair. "Sarah told me you got upset about the painting. Look, I know change is hard, but you have to admit, this place could use some updating. It's been the same since I was a kid." "That's the point," I said. "This is my home with my memories, my choices. But it's our home too now," Michael replied. "Sarah and I aren't just visiting anymore. We live here. We should have some say in how the place looks and feels." I stared at my son, searching for some recognition of how wrong this was, some acknowledgement of my rights as the actual owner of this property. Instead, I saw a man who had completely aligned himself with his wife's perspective, who saw my attachment to my own home as an obstacle to their happiness. The final blow came 2 days later, during what Sarah called a family meeting. She sat across from me at my own dining room table and delivered what she clearly thought was a reasonable proposal. "Leonina, Michael and I have been talking, and we think it's time to be honest about what everyone needs. This house is perfect for a young family, but it's really too big for one person. You've had your time here, you've raised your family here, and now it's our turn to make it a home for our future children." She paused as if expecting me to thank her for this generous offer to take over my life's work. "We're prepared to take over the mortgage payments and all house expenses. You could find a nice little condo somewhere, maybe one of those senior communities with activities and people your own age. This way, everyone gets what they need." I couldn't breathe. "There is no mortgage, Sarah. I own this house outright." "Well, even better," she continued, not missing a beat. "That means you'll have equity to buy something perfect for your next chapter. This house isn't really suitable for someone your age anyway. All these stairs, the maintenance, the yard work. Wouldn't you rather be somewhere more manageable?" Michael sat silent through this entire speech. When I looked at him desperately, hoping for some intervention, he finally spoke. "Mom, maybe Sarah has a point. This place is a lot for you to handle alone, and we really do need the space for our future." That's when Sarah delivered the words that would change everything. "Let's be honest here, Leona. This isn't your home anymore. This is our home now, and there just isn't enough space for all of us to be happy. Maybe it's time you found your own place where you can have your own space and we can have ours. We're trying to build a life here." Michael nodded in agreement. "Sarah's right, Mom. We need to think about what's best for everyone." I looked at my son, this man I had raised and loved unconditionally, and realized that somewhere along the way, I had lost him completely. In his eyes, I saw nothing but support for his wife's vision of a future that didn't include me. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I simply stood up from that dining room table, walked upstairs to my bedroom, and began packing my essential belongings. If they wanted me out, I would leave. But not because I agreed with them. I was leaving to give myself time to think clearly and decide how to handle this betrayal. Sarah seemed relieved by my calm reaction. "I'm so glad you understand, Leona. This really is for the best. You'll see." Michael followed me upstairs, perhaps expecting some emotional breakdown that would make him feel guilty. Instead, he found me methodically folding clothes and selecting important documents from my filing cabinet. "Mom, you don't have to leave today. Take your time to find a place." I looked at him with new clarity. "Your wife made it very clear that this isn't my home anymore. She's right about one thing: there isn't enough space here. There isn't enough space for people who respect me and people who don't." "That's not fair," Michael protested. "We do respect you." Respect doesn't tell someone to find their own place in their own house, Michael. Respect doesn't change locks and make unilateral decorating decisions. Respect doesn't plan out someone's future without including them in the conversation. He had no answer for that. I finished packing 2 suitcases with clothes and personal items. Then I went to my home office and collected specific documents that Sarah and Michael had probably never thought about. The original deed to the house, David's will, leaving everything to me: property tax records, homeowners' insurance policies, and most importantly, the legal papers establishing my sole ownership of this property. As I read through these documents that night in my hotel room, a realization began forming. Michael and Sarah had made a critical assumption about their status in this house. They assumed that living there gave them rights, that being family meant automatic inheritance, that their contributions to household expenses created some kind of ownership stake. They were wrong on every count. I called my attorney, George Patterson, first thing Monday morning. George had handled David's estate and knew our family situation well. When I explained what had happened, there was a long pause before he spoke. "Leona, I have to ask, do Michael and Sarah actually believe they have legal claim to this property?" "I think they believe their needs supersede my rights," I replied. "Well, let me be very clear about the legal reality here. You are the sole owner of that house. They are not tenants with a lease. They're not family members with inheritance rights, and they have no legal standing whatsoever. They are, in the eyes of the law, guests who have overstayed their welcome." George explained my options, and that's when the idea formed. If Sarah wanted to treat this like a business arrangement rather than a family situation, I could accommodate that request. If they wanted a house without the complications of family obligations, I could provide exactly that. I spent the next week researching rental rates in my neighborhood, consulting with a property management company, and preparing legal documents. The average rent for a 3-bedroom Victorian like mine was $2,800 per month. Market rate for people who wanted a house without family complications. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Sarah had told me to find my own place, I returned to my house. I wasn't alone. George Patterson accompanied me along with Margaret Hendricks from Hendricks Property Management. Margaret carried a folder full of official documents, and George had his legal briefcase. I carried my keys. Sarah answered the door in her pajamas, clearly not expecting company. Her face went through several emotions when she saw me: confusion, annoyance, and then something that might have been guilt. "Leona, what are you doing here? And who are these people?" "Good morning, Sarah," I replied calmly. "I'm here in my capacity as the property owner. This is my attorney, George Patterson, and this is Margaret Hendricks from the property management company that will be handling this house going forward." Sarah's face paled. "Property management? What are you talking about?" "May we come in?" I asked politely. "We have some paperwork to discuss with you and Ekel." Sarah reluctantly stepped aside, and we entered what had been my living room, but now looked completely different with the new paint and Sarah's furniture arrangement. She called for Michael, who appeared quickly, still in his work clothes from his morning shift. "What's going on?" Michael asked, looking between me and the two professionals I had brought with me. I sat down in what used to be my favorite chair and smiled pleasantly. "I've been thinking about what Sarah said last week, and she was absolutely right about several things. This isn't my home anymore, it's my property. And since you both made it clear that you don't want me here as family, I'm here today as your landlord." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael and Sarah looked at each other, then back at me as if I had started speaking a foreign language. "Landlord." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "That's correct," George interjected, opening his briefcase. "Mrs. Rodriguez is the sole legal owner of this property, and you two are currently occupying it without a lease agreement. We're here to formalize your tenancy." Margaret opened her folder and placed a rental agreement on the coffee table. "The market rate for this property is $2,800 per month, plus utilities. This is a standard 12-month lease with all the typical tenant responsibilities and landlord rights clearly outlined." Michael finally found his voice. "Mom, this is insane. We're family." I looked at him with the same calm expression I had maintained throughout this entire encounter. "Family doesn't tell each other to find somewhere else to live, Michael. Family doesn't change locks and redecorate without permission. Family doesn't plan out someone's future without including them. You and Sarah made it very clear that our relationship is not familial when it comes to this house." "But $2,800. Sarah was looking at the lease agreement like it might bite her. "We can't afford that." "That's the market rate," Margaret explained matter-of-factly. "Actually, it's slightly below market for a property of this size and condition in this neighborhood. Mrs. Rodriguez is being quite generous." George pulled out another set of documents. "You have 30 days to either sign the lease agreement or vacate the property. These are the formal notices required by state law for occupants without legal tenancy rights." I watched Sarah's face as the reality of the situation sank in. She had wanted a house without the complications of family dynamics, and now she was getting exactly that. A business arrangement with a landlord who had no obligation to accommodate her preferences or consider her financial limitations. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said, her voice rising. "You can't just turn us into tenants overnight." "Actually, I can," I replied. "You told me this was your house now, and I should find my own place. I'm simply acknowledging that if this is your house, you need to pay for it, like any other house you might want to live in." Michael was staring at the monthly rent figure. $2,800 plus utilities. "Mom, that's more than we were paying for our apartment downtown." "Yes, but, as Sarah pointed out, this house has so much more to offer. Plenty of space for your future family, a yard updated paint in the living room, all the things that make it perfect for your needs." Margaret explained the lease terms in detail. Standard tenant responsibilities, no pets without permission, no alterations to the property without written consent, 30 days notice for any changes in tenancy. All the protections and limitations that come with a proper landlord-tenant relationship. You'll also need to provide first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit equal to 1 month's rent, George added. "That's $8,400 upfront, due upon signing." Sarah looked like she might faint. $8,400. We don't have that kind of money." "Then perhaps you should consider other housing options," I suggested helpfully. "I understand there are some nice apartments in your price range across town." Michael was doing calculations in his head, probably realizing that even with both their incomes, $2,800 plus utilities, would consume most of their monthly earnings. "Mom, please, can't we work something out? As family?" "Oh, you want to be family again?" I asked. "That's interesting. Last week family wasn't working for you. You wanted independence and space, and the right to make decisions without considering my feelings or my property rights. This lease gives you all of that." The room fell silent again, as Michael and Sarah absorbed the impossible position they had put themselves in. They couldn't afford the rent, but they had no legal right to demand anything else. They had pushed out the family member who had been subsidizing their lifestyle, and now they were facing the true cost of the independence they had demanded. "What if we apologize?" Sarah asked quietly. "What if we admit we made mistakes and try to work things out as family again?" I considered her question seriously. "Sarah, what exactly would you be apologizing for? For telling me to find my own place in my own house, for changing my locks, for redecorating without permission, for planning to convert my sewing room into your nursery without asking, for treating me like an inconvenient elderly relative who needed to be managed, rather than the homeowner who was helping you?" She had no answer because we both knew that apologizing for those things meant admitting they were wrong from the beginning, and her entire argument had been that they were justified in their demands. George packed up his documents. "You have 30 days to decide. Sign the lease and become legal tenants, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails, or find alternative housing. Mrs. Rodriguez has been more than accommodating by offering you the option to stay." As they prepared to leave, Margaret handed Sarah her business card. "If you decide to sign the lease, you can reach me at this number. If you decide to move out, please coordinate with me for the property inspection and return of any personal items." After they left, I sat in my newly painted living room with my son and his wife. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Michael finally spoke. "Mom, I know we handled this badly, but this feels like revenge." Revenge would be evicting you immediately, which I have every legal right to do since you have no lease and no tenant protections, I replied. "This is consequences. You wanted to treat this like a business arrangement instead of a family situation. I'm giving you exactly what you asked for." Over the next 2 weeks, I watched Michael and Sarah struggle with their impossible situation from the comfortable distance of my hotel room. They spent their evenings looking at apartments they couldn't afford and trying to figure out how to come up with $8,400 for move-in costs. Michael called me several times each conversation, growing more desperate. First, he tried to negotiate the rent amount. Then he asked if I would waive the security deposit. Finally, he begged me to just forget the whole thing and go back to the way things were. The way things were wasn't working, I reminded him. You and Sarah made that very clear. You said I needed to find my own place because there wasn't enough space for all of us to be happy. You were right. There wasn't enough space for people who respect each other and people who don't. Sarah tried a different approach. She came to my hotel one evening, tears in her eyes, explaining how sorry she was and how she hoped we could start over. She talked about stress from unemployment, anxiety about the future, and feeling like she needed to take control of something in her life when everything else felt chaotic. I listened patiently to her explanation, and then I asked her a simple question. "Sarah, if I had been your tenant, and you had been my landlord, and I had changed your locks, redecorated your house without permission, and then told you to find your own place, what would you have done?" She couldn't answer because we both knew she would have evicted me immediately. On the 28th day, Michael and Sarah packed their belongings and moved out. They found a small 2-bedroom apartment across town, the kind of place they could have afforded 6 months earlier if they hadn't assumed my house came with their marriage. I helped them move, not because I had to, but because despite everything, Michael was still my son. I even helped with their security deposit, for the new place a gift from mother to son, but not from landlord to tenant. The day after they left, I walked through my empty house and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. My home was mine again, not because I had fought for it, but because I had stopped letting other people define what it meant. I changed the locks again, this time back to my own preferences. I repainted the living room in colors that made me happy. I moved my mother's china cabinet back to its rightful place in the dining room. Most importantly, I started hosting dinner parties for my neighbors' friends, from book club people who appreciated the invitation and never questioned my right to offer it. 3 months later, Michael and Sarah announced they were expecting their first child. I was thrilled for them and immediately started knitting baby blankets and planning grandmother gifts. But when Sarah hinted that they might need help with childcare and that my house would be perfect for family gatherings, I smiled and suggested they were welcome to visit anytime. just like any other guests. Michael asked if this meant I would never forgive them for what happened. I explained that forgiveness and boundaries were two different things. I had forgiven them for not understanding their place in my home, but I had learned the importance of maintaining clear boundaries about what I would and wouldn't accept in my own space. The relationship we have now is different, but it's healthier. Michael and Sarah visit every other Sunday for dinner. They bring flowers or wine they help clean up afterward, and they never stay longer than invited. They treat me with the respect that should have been there from the beginning, not because they're afraid of me, but because they finally understand that respect isn't automatic, even between family members. Sometimes people mistake kindness for weakness and generosity for obligation. I learned that setting boundaries isn't mean it's necessary. I learned that my home became truly mine again when I stopped letting others define its value or my place in it. When people ask if I regret being so harsh with my own son and daughter-in-law, I tell them about the dinner party I hosted last weekend. 12 neighbors and friends gathered around my dining room table, enjoying food and conversation in a house where everyone felt welcome because everyone understood they were guests in someone else's home. They wanted a house without me in it. I gave them exactly what they asked for, just not the way they expected it. Sometimes the best way to keep your family close is to show them what life looks like when you're not around to fix everything. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who took your generosity for granted? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life family experiences. Share this with anyone who might need to hear that it's okay to stand up for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, your home should be your sanctuary, not your burden. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the spaces that matter to you.